Welcome back to State and Local Government and Politics, Module 6, Legislatures, Part 6, Variation among State Legislatures. State legislatures vary across the country in terms of their official names, the length of time they stay in session, the number of legislative districts they use, their party affiliations, and the way they operate. For example, state legislatures in most states are called legislatures. For example, the Alabama legislature, the Oklahoma legislature, the Nevada legislature, and Montana state legislature are common names. In some states, however, the state legislature is referred to as the General Assembly, such as the Virginia General Assembly and the Pennsylvania General Assembly. In the states of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, the term General Court is used to designate the state legislative branch. For bicameral state legislative bodies, the upper house is most typically called the Senate, but the terms used for the lower house vary widely across the states. Historically, most of the original American colonies were governed by a unicameral legislative system until a gradual process of adoption of bicameralism started and picked up momentum. The bicameralism model was based on respect for the British model of bicameralism of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Today, as noted previously, virtually all state legislatures in the U.S. are bicameral. Only Nebraska has maintained a unicameral legislature. Another difference between state legislatures concerns time status. Some states have full-time legislatures meeting frequently on an annual basis, while other states have part-time legislatures that meet biannually and infrequently. Many rural states tend to have a part-time legislature, while the states with larger populations are likely to have full-time legislatures. Texas is an exception in this regard, with the second largest population and a part-time legislature. The National Council of State Legislatures has categorized the 50 state legislatures into three basic groups. Full-time legislatures require the most time of legislators, usually 80% or more of a full-time job. These legislatures typically feature large staffs, and their members are usually paid salaries sufficient to make a decent living. Full-time legislatures are typically found in the states with a highly urbanized population. Legislators elected to hybrid legislatures typically say that they spend more than two-thirds of a full-time job being legislators, and their salaries are noticeably higher than part-time legislatures, but somewhat lower than those members of full-time legislatures. Salaries are typically not sufficient to make a living on legislative pay alone, so additional outside employment is common among these state lawmakers. Hybrid legislatures tend to have intermediate-sized staff, and they are typically found in states with moderate-sized populations. Virginia has a hybrid legislature. Lawmakers in part-time legislatures generally spend the equivalent of half of a full-time job doing legislative work. The compensation they receive for this work is quite low and requires them to have other sources of income in order to make a living. Part-time legislatures are often called citizen legislatures and are most often found in rural states with relatively small populations. The legislative staff available to lawmakers in these states are typically few. State legislatures are also diverse in terms of their size. See Table 6.7 in the text, and their party composition. Legislators prefer policies that favor the preferences of voters in individual districts, and thus the size of the district matters when considering the implications of certain policies. General-purpose local governments, which include county governments, municipal governments, and township governments, provide a wide range of services that affect the day-to-day lives of citizens. These governments feature both an executive and legislative function. The executive function will be discussed later in the course. The number of bills introduced into legislatures and enacted into law also varies greatly across the American states. See Table 6.9 in the text. For example, 14,823 bills were introduced, and 589 bills were enacted into law in New York in 2015. In stark contrast, there were only 391 bills introduced and 204 bills enacted into law in Wyoming in the same year. In Part 7 of Module 6 on legislatures, we'll discuss legislatures and general-purpose local governments.